The late afternoon sun cast a pale orange glow over the town of Ruston, reflecting off the dusty windows and weathered roofs. The early winter wind blew gently through the empty streets, carrying the damp smell of the earth after the rain and the bitter cold of the Midwest. Ruby's Diner, an old diner located right at the central intersection, appeared as a part of the town's long-standing memory, where every local person has stopped by at least once, even if only to sip a cup of hot coffee to warm their hearts. The bright red neon sign reading Ruby's Diner since 1954 flickered in the evening light, as if to hold back time, preserving a bit of warmth amid the cold changes of the town that once thrived because of the steel mills that have now closed. The jingling bell at the entrance was like a familiar greeting for anyone who entered, whether they were relatives or strangers. But tonight, when J.D. Vance, looking tired after a long day of work, pushed open the door and entered, the entire place held its breath for a brief moment. J.D. was no stranger to scrutiny, but as he stepped through the door, he could still feel the change in the atmosphere, like a slight electric current running through the room that had been filled with chatter and laughter. Linda Mayfield, a waitress who had been with the place for 20 years, was holding a pot of hot coffee in her hand, and she stopped abruptly when their eyes met. Her familiar smile of greeting vanished in an instant, replaced by a quick glance at the kitchen counter, where Frank Dawson, the tough but austere owner, stood hastily wiping his hands of cake batter. At the corner of the counter, Walter Jenkins, the old man with white hair and calloused hands, was stirring a cup of hot coffee. If you love engaging, dramatic stories and thrilling cases, don't forget to subscribe to the channel today. Each video is a journey full of surprises, taking you into the world of unsolved mysteries. Join me in exploring, analyzing, and feeling every detail of the story. Next to him, Mike Reynolds, a young man with messy brown hair, a muscular build but a face darkened by months of unemployment, leaned on his hands and looked straight at J.D. with an unreadable gaze. The whole room fell into a strange silence. A silence that did not require words, but was enough for the observant to realize that J.D. Vance was not welcome tonight. J.D. walked slowly, his leather shoes creaking on the old tiles, his eyes scanning the black and white photos on the wall. Photos of people who had been the soul of the town. Workers with greasy hands, old faces but honest smiles. And perhaps he himself, a boy who had grown up in these poor neighborhoods, understood better than anyone the meaning of the eyes that were focused on him. But he still kept a slight smile, even though his heart was full of turmoil. Linda, after a few awkward seconds, stepped closer, her voice lower and more reserved than usual. "Hello. Hello, sir. Are you eating here or taking away?" The question seemed simple, but it sounded awkward, making the people around hold their breath, waiting for a response. J.D. smiled slightly, the smile of someone who was used to unpleasant challenges much more than the suspicious eyes here. "I think I'll stay, if you don't mind." Linda nodded, but her eyes were absent-minded, as if looking for someone's approval, and like a hard-to-break habit, she quickly glanced at Frank, who was standing behind the counter. His hand was squeezing the towel so tightly that the veins on his hands were visible. No one said anything, but J.D. understood. He stood there, amidst heavy gazes, wondering what had caused someone born in this very land to be pushed out as if he were a stranger. The sound of a spoon hitting a coffee cup rang out from Walter, as if breaking the heavy silence. The old man looked straight at J.D., his blue eyes cloudy but not necessarily lacking in sharpness. His lips curled slightly. "It's been a long time since I've seen you here, Vance." J.D. nodded. "Yeah, it's been a while. But still looking forward to sitting down and having something to eat, like the last time." No one responded. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was so much to say that they didn't know where to start. And perhaps mostly because of the frustration and anger they had buried for so long. Frank finally stepped away from the counter, wiped his hands on his apron, and approached, his voice low and firm, as if he had weighed each word carefully before saying it. "J.D., I don't want to cause trouble, but tonight maybe you should go somewhere else." The voice wasn't hostile. On the contrary, it contained the weariness of someone who had seen too much that couldn't be undone. J.D. looked at Frank, then looked around the shop that had been his refuge during his troubled childhood years. The room, with its pictures on the walls, its old wooden tables, even the lingering smell of apple pie from the afternoon was a part of him. "Frank, I just want a quiet dinner," JD said slowly, his eyes fixed on the owner in a silent plea. "Like everyone else. Am I not a native of this town?" Frank paused, his eyes filled with confusion. Mike spoke from the corner of the room, his voice sharp as a knife. "A native of this town? A real person wouldn't stand on television and forget about us?" The words hit like a powerful blow, making the air thick. JD took a deep breath, but before he could reply, Walter spoke, his voice old but steady. "That kid. I remember him running around this place begging for sandwiches. Don't forget, Frank, we were family here." There was a long silence. JD looked at Walter, grateful but also bitter. The best memories, now a deep wound. In the end, JD said only one sentence, his voice warm and quiet. "I did not come here to do politics. Just a son looking for an old home, if this is still home." And so the story began. From that unpoured cup of coffee, from a rejected seat, and from the silence that had accumulated over the years of a community that was too heartbroken to trust anyone again. The room fell silent again after J.D. Vance's words, a heavy silence that was not easy to break. But beneath that calm exterior were surging waves, unsettled anger and lost trust. J.D. still stood there amid the eyes that did not leave him. Each person had a different emotion, but all had one thing in common. They wanted answers. No one invited him to sit, no one spoke up to defend him, but no one chased him away like in the gossip stories out there. Frank stood still, his eyes now as if weighing between the old friendship and the pressure from the customers who were observing his every move. He sighed, his hands cracked by years of work clenching and unclenching, as if to extinguish what was simmering inside. "JD," he called softly, his voice hoarse. "You know, we here have never been forgetful. People say all sorts of things about you, about the way you left and then appeared on TV, wrote books. Who are you protecting, JD? Certainly not the people who once considered you their own flesh and blood here." Those words were like a knife stabbing into JD's heart. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but deep in his eyes, sadness was quietly evident. Walter, who had been sitting silently all this time, gently placed his cup of coffee on the table, his eyes staring into the space in front of him, as if he was seeing the distant past. "Frank, this kid used to run around this diner, with his ragged shoes and the oldest shirt in the village," he began, his voice slow as if telling an old story. "He was part of this community. I remember his mother, Bev, always holding his hand and leading him over here, asking me to give him a sandwich. No one thought he'd ever leave, but now he's standing there, like a stranger." JD clenched his fists. The memories came back clearly. He remembered his mother's messy hair, the tired, pained look in her eyes as she led him to Ruby's diner for help. He remembered the days he'd sat huddled in the corner of the diner, listening to stories about men who had just lost their jobs, about houses about to be foreclosed on. Those stories, even as a child, were imprinted on his mind. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Frank and everyone around him. His voice was low and husky, but each word was firm and full of emotion. I know I left. I know I did things you didn't approve of. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the hungry days, the days I watched my mother cry in the kitchen. And I never forgot who fed us, who pulled out the chair for me to sit on. It was this restaurant. It was you. Frank's eyes wavered. Mike, sitting at the back of the restaurant, folded his arms, sneered. "So what did you come back for? To complain? To tell us I understand while you were on TV sitting in a warm place?" he said, his voice harsh. JD turned, facing Mike. No avoidance, no anger, just a straight look, like a man who is used to bitterness. "I came back because I know, even though I'm far away, our pain has never left me. And I know," Many people here feel that I have betrayed them, but I stand here to listen, to face, to answer, not to hide." The room fell silent. Outside the window, the sky had turned dark. The yellow streetlights shone into the shop, illuminating the faces marked by time and the skeptical eyes. Walter spoke again, softly but firmly. "The question is not whether you came back to talk, JD. The question is, do you still feel like you belong here, or did you just come to ease your conscience?" JD bowed his head, then looked up, his eyes shining with an indescribable emotion mixed with pain and hope. I am not sure, but I want to try. I want to hear everything. If I'm wrong, I'll admit it. If I've let anyone down, I want to know. But I also want you to know, even though my life is different, my heart is still here, in this bar, in the memory of the days when I had nothing but gratitude. A breeze blew through the crack in the door, making the door shake slightly as if in response to those sincere words. Frank sighed. He placed his hand on the counter, his eyes softening a little. He didn't say anything, but then turned to Linda. "Linda, give him a cup of coffee." Linda paused, then nodded, pouring coffee into an old porcelain cup with a slight crack on the rim, the cup JD's mother used to drink from. She brought it over, placing it in front of JD. "We brewed it strong. Hope you remember the taste." Her voice softened, but her eyes were still wary. JD smiled slightly, reaching out to take the cup of coffee. The warmth spread through his hand, like a link to the deepest memories of his childhood. "Thank you, Linda. I remember. And I hope, today, we can start over here." Frank stood up straight, his voice quiet but sincere. "So, JD, sit down. If you dare to listen, then we will talk, and maybe, just maybe, we will listen to you again." JD Vance sat down on the old wooden chair, his back slightly hunched, his hands holding the steaming cup of coffee. He looked around the Ruby's diner, which had once been a safe haven for the young JD, but had now become a place to test the courage of the grown man. Frank stood behind the bar, his arms crossed, his eyes no longer as fierce as before, but instead filled with anxiety, an internal struggle that he himself had not yet found a way out of. In that moment of silence, Walter, the most consistent old man who had also witnessed JD grow up, spoke first, breaking the heavy atmosphere. "JD, you said you wanted to listen, right? Then listen." His voice was hoarse, trembling but determined. The whole place seemed to hold its breath, all eyes on him. "You know, the day your mother died, Bev, no one stood up to give her a proper funeral except people like us. You were far away. Do you know how we felt? The feeling of losing someone who was a neighbor, who ate at the same table, who cried with her, and her son, the one she loved most in her life, wasn't there." JD clenched his hands around his coffee cup. He remembered that day. He was far away, busy with political meetings, TV shows, thinking he was doing great things, but he never forgave himself for not being there when his mother passed away. He lowered his eyes, regret like an old scar that hadn't healed yet. "Walter, I know, and I can't apologize enough to make up for that." Silence. But that silence was no longer cold. It was the silence of hearts facing unspeakable losses. Then Linda, the girl who had witnessed JD since her teenage years, also spoke up, her voice soft but full of resentment. "You said you missed this place, but have you ever wondered how this place changed when you left? The people sitting here used to be your family, but when you left, we stayed, facing difficulties. And every time I turn on the TV, I see you sitting there, talking like a politician, you know, JD. I wonder, do you still remember who we are?" JD raised his head and looked straight at Linda. His eyes were red, but he didn't avoid them. He exhaled, his voice trembling but sincere. "Linda, I remember. I remember every single person here. I remember the time I had to sleep on the bench at the end of this shop when my mother didn't come home. I remember the meals Frank gave me just because he was afraid I'd starve. But I thought, if I was successful, I could help more. And I was wrong. I was wrong to think I could help from afar without going home. Frank nodded slightly, as if acknowledging that JD was telling the truth, but he wasn't ready to forgive, at least not yet. Then, suddenly, a voice came from the back of the shop. Jake, a middle-aged man, wearing a grease-stained work shirt, probably just off work. "Do you know how many families lost their jobs when the factory closed, JD? You go around talking about the poor in the Rust Belt, but my family had to sell our car to get through the month. Where were you when we lost everything?" The question was like a knife piercing JD's heart, but this time, he didn't dodge or change the subject. "Jake, I wasn't there, and that's my fault. I know I wrote the book, I talked on TV, but I wasn't here. I didn't ask about your family. I didn't know how much you suffered, and I'm sorry. But that's why I came back. I don't want to be just a name in a book on TV. I want to start over, from the place where I grew up." The atmosphere in the cafe calmed down, but there were still skeptical eyes. Because words weren't enough. But at least a small crack had appeared in the wall that separated JD from this community. Frank nodded, his eyes shining with patience, as if testing to see if JD was really listening. "If you want to start over, JD, start by listening. Sit here, drink coffee, and hear everything we have to say. No excuses, no promises, just listen." JD smiled slightly, nodded. "I'm ready. I'm not going anywhere." Linda slowly poured more coffee into his cup, and this time, not with a strange look, but as if to say, "Okay, let's try again." The small room of Ruby's diner seemed to quiet down, except for the clatter of coffee spoons and soft sighs. Outside, the afternoon was falling, the last sunlight streaming through the frosted glass windows, casting shadows of the people inside the diner on the walls. But inside, everyone knew that a frank conversation was about to begin, and no one could avoid it any longer. JD Vance sat still, his hands clasped together on the table, his eyes fixed on Frank as if to say he was ready to hear the truth, no matter how painful it was. Frank, the old owner, spoke first, his voice slow and heavy with long-held feelings. "JD, you know, in this town, losing a factory is losing a generation. Losing a job is losing self-respect. But the most painful thing is losing faith. Faith in the people who used to belong here, like you." The sentence fell into the air like a silent verdict. JD swallowed hard, but did not respond immediately. He knew. He came here today to listen. Linda, a middle-aged waitress who was JD's old classmate, sat down on the chair opposite, poured more coffee into his cup, then raised her head to look straight into JD's eyes, her eyes both sad and angry. "You know, JD, when you were on TV talking about the pain of the Rust Belt people, I cried. Not because I was moved, but because I felt betrayed. You told your story as if you understood everything, but you weren't here to see us struggle every day." Her voice choked, but she continued. "Do you know how many kids had to drop out of school to go to work after the factory closed? How many families were evicted because they couldn't pay the rent? I thought you would be our voice, but then you, like everyone else, JD, left." JD bit his lip. His heart felt like a knife was twisting deeply, but his eyes remained firm. "Linda, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can say to erase those losses, but I want to hear more. Tell me, let me understand everything. This time, really understand." Walter, the old man sitting at the counter, who had been silent until now, also spoke slowly, his voice hoarse from years of smoking and fatigue. "Do you remember your father, Donald Vance, JD? He worked hard in the iron mill for 30 years. You were his only hope. But when he died, who was by his side? Only us. And you're somewhere in Washington or New York. Maybe you don't even know he had to mortgage his house to pay for his medical treatment." The words were like a knife stabbing straight into JD's heart. He stared down at his coffee cup, his eyes red. "I know. And I've never forgiven myself for that, Walter. I thought that if I reached out into the bigger world, I could come back and help people, but I was wrong to wait so long to come back." Silence, a heavy silence. not of hatred but of the pain of those who have been disappointed too many times. And then a soft voice rose from the corner of Alicia's shop, a young girl that JD recognized as the niece of his old neighbor. "Brother." "JD, when I was little, my mother used to say, 'JD is an example for you. You have to study hard like him to get out of this place. But brother, once you get out of here, who will take care of those who can't leave? And my mother, who is now sick and no one helps? When you were on TV, I was happy for you, but also heartbroken, because I saw that you no longer belonged here." Elisa's voice trembled, as if expressing the feeling she had hidden for years. JD looked at Elise, then turned to the familiar faces: Walter with his tired eyes, Linda full of sorrow, Frank with the helpless look of an old father. And he knew he had let them down, but also realized that he still had a chance to start over, to listen and connect. He nodded, choking up. "Elise, Linda, Walter, Frank. I know no words can make up for the years I was absent, but I won't go anymore. I want to start over, here, with everyone. If I still have a chance to make things right, I would like to spend the rest of my life doing it." No one said anything right away, but their eyes seemed to soften, not as harsh as before, and Frank, the oldest, the one who had been hurt the most, was the first to speak, his voice low but warm. "If you say so, JD. Then from tomorrow, come back here, sit down with us, have dinner, listen to each person's story, and if you are sincere, you will see things you never saw when you stood on the podium." JD smiled slightly, although the corners of his eyes were still wet. "Thank you, Uncle Frank. I will do it. I will sit here every day if necessary." Elise also smiled thinly, although her eyes were still sad. But that was the first step. The next morning, Ruby's diner opened earlier than usual. The thin morning sunlight penetrated through the frosted glass, shining on the old wooden chairs, which had witnessed many ordinary stories of the people of this town. And in the middle of that scene, JD Vance appeared. This time, not in a formal suit, not with the appearance of a politician, but as a simple man in faded jeans, a rolled-up shirt, and eyes that showed fatigue and determination. He opened the heavy wooden door of the shop. The bell rang softly, as if to remind everyone that he had returned, just as he had promised last night. Frank, the owner, was wiping the tables and looked up at him, his eyes still stern but a little softer for a moment. "You really came?" Frank said softly, as if surprised and probing. JD smiled and nodded. "I promised, Uncle Frank. I didn't come to talk today, I came to listen." Linda, the middle-aged waitress, looked at him from behind the counter, her face doubtful but also curious. She poured a cup of coffee, brought it out, and placed it in front of him without saying anything. Only her eyes spoke louder than 1,000 words. "Let's see what you can do." JD sat down, stirring his coffee quietly. The warmth of the cup wafted over his face, but his heart was heavy. He knew that trust could not be restored with a promise, but with action, little by little. Stories never told. During the morning, JD listened to stories that no one had told him before. Walter sat at the counter again, his veined hand holding a chipped cup of coffee. He told of the last days of the iron mill where he and JD's father had worked. "We lost our jobs, our pensions, and my best friend Sam, his wife left because she couldn't stand the poverty. Who's left? We're just sitting here, looking at these old crumbling walls every day." Linda, while clearing away the tables and chairs, told of her niece who was trying to go to college but couldn't afford books. "She wants to get out of here, like you did, JD, but now she's scared. Scared that if she leaves, she'll never come back, like you." Those stories were like a deep cut into JD's heart. Every word, every look made him realize that the pain of this town was bigger than he thought, and deeper than what he had said on TV. In the following days, JD did not just sit and listen. He started doing the smallest things to show everyone that he was serious about his promise. On Monday afternoon, JD took the initiative to ask Frank for some spare parts for the shop, to wipe the tables and chairs, and to refill the cups. Linda silently observed, sometimes curling her lips as if she wanted to laugh. But gradually she no longer looked at him with contempt. Who would ever see J.D. Vance wiping the tables one day? Linda blurted out, half jokingly. J.D. just smiled, still holding the tool. Maybe you need to start with the smallest tasks to understand what life is really like here. Elise, the young girl who had won J.D.'s championship, calmly sat down and talked to him. For the first time, J.D. heard her talk about her life struggling with working 2 shifts to take care of her seriously ill mother, about worrying about tuition fees and her dream of going far away but not having the courage to leave her mother behind. Do you know what it feels like to see your mother in pain and chew enough money to buy medicine? J.D., Elise asked, her eyes red. J.D. sweetly took her hand. I don't know everything, Elise, but if you give me a chance, I'll do everything I can to help. After a week, everyone in the bar began to look at J.D. with different eyes, not completely trusting, but at least not cold anymore. One evening, when the bar was about to close, Mr. Walter spoke again, this time in a gentler voice. You're doing well, J.D., but don't think that's enough. People need jobs, need hospitals, need hope, not just cleaning tables or drinking bananas. J.D. nodded, her eyes full. I know, and I'm planning. I want to open a career center to teach jobs to people who have lost their jobs, but I can't do it alone. I need you. I need everyone to work together. Walter was silent for a moment, then slowly said, If you're full, I'll help. But this time, don't leave again. As J.D. walked out of the diner into the soft night, the light of Ruby's lantern shone on the quiet street. He stopped, looked at the old sign that had faded from the rain and sun, and for the first time in many years, he felt his heart lighten. He understood one thing. Belonging to a place is not just a memory, but an action. It is returning and living with the pain, the hopes, the smallest things of the place where you grew up. The next morning, Ruby's diner opened as usual, but today there was something different in the air. There were no longer cold eyes like the first days J.D. returned. Instead, there were curious looks, gentle nods, and perhaps a glimmer of hope in the souls that were too tired of empty promises. J.D. Vance walked into the diner. This time he did not come to me. He was accompanied by Beth, a young woman from the town who had just lost her job at the garment factory, and Mr. Walter, who had challenged J.D.'s glory yesterday, who had agreed to accompany him. Frank, the owner, emerged from behind the counter, looking at J.D. with eyes that were still suspicious but also filled with acceptance. He understood that, whether he wanted to or not, everyone was waiting for a light at the end of the tunnel. You're early, Frank said softly, his voice low but without the worry of before. Hello, Uncle Frank. I didn't come here to talk, I came here to do, J.D. replied firmly. J.D. and everyone else sat at a long table by the window, overlooking the town's main street, with its bankrupt stores and dilapidated houses that couldn't be repaired. Frank, Linda, Elise, Mr. Walter, and a few other residents took their seats. The entire cafeteria held its breath, for this was the first time in years that a real community meeting had been held to discuss the future. J.D. began not with a speech, but with the truth. I know I've been away for too long, and I know the promises I made have disappointed you. But today, I want to hear from you. What do you think this town needs to come back to life? The atmosphere was heavy. Everyone was silent, as if afraid that if they spoke, the fragile hope would be shattered again. But then Beth, the young girl with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights worrying about her little child, spoke first. I need a job, J.D. A real job. I don't need empty promises. I don't need useless courses. I need money to feed my child. I need to know if I'll have enough money to pay the electric bill next month. Beth's words seemed to break the silence. People began to speak up. We need doctors, hospitals. Every time someone gets seriously ill, we have to drive 30 miles to the nearest hospital, Mr. Walter added. The kids need better schools. Don't let them drop out just because they don't have enough teachers. Linda, her eyes welling up, said, And we need to know that if you do it, you'll stay with us and not disappear when things get tough. Frank concluded, his voice full of seriousness. JD listened to every word, every sigh, every pain that had been stored up for years. He understood that before he could talk about policy, before he could draw up grand plans, he needed to do something concrete and immediate. After a moment of silence, JD looked at everyone and said slowly, with determination, "I don't have all the answers, but I have a network. I have friends who trust me. If everyone agrees with me, we can start with the simplest thing, a career center right here in town, where people like Beth who have lost their jobs can get training for new jobs, where children can get extra education, where the elderly can get basic health care." Frank frowned. "Do you think you can build something like that in this poor, run-down town?" JD smiled, for the first time since the meeting began. "I think with all these people sitting here, nothing is impossible. But I can't do it alone. I need everyone to start together, and if necessary, I'll use my own name to call for outside investment. But most importantly, I'm not leaving. I'm staying here, working side by side with everyone." Another silence, but this time it was not doubt but consideration, touching the faith that was slowly coming back to life. Mr. Walter leaned his hands on the table, looking straight into JD's eyes. "Are you sure you understand what you're saying? If you fail, you will not only lose your reputation, but also kill the only faith that remains here." JD nodded, his voice low. "I know, and I'm willing to bet everything, because I owe it to everyone, and most of all, because I want to see this place come back to life." Frank looked around the room, then sighed. "Okay, but JD, don't let us down again." As everyone left the bar, the afternoon sunlight shone through the old glass, reflecting a new light, the light of hope that this town had not seen for a long time. JD stood at the door, watching each person. He knew today was only the first step, but it was the first step of a journey that would not be easy. Just days after the historic meeting at Ruby's Diner, the mood in Springfield began to change. Though people still walked up and down the dusty Main Street, for the first time in years, the conversation was not about bad news or unemployment, but about the hopeful question, can JD do it? The next morning, JD Vance drove through the small streets, visiting abandoned buildings that had once been shops, strip malls, and cobweb machine shops. Frank and Beth went along, helping JD point out the best places to start a community employment center. "I think Walter's old shop might be a good place. It doesn't have to be fancy, just a place where people can learn a trade, meet, and start over," JD said, pushing open the rusty metal door. Frank stood by, looking at the silent factory, and said, "You know, this place used to be bustling, the sound of machines, people laughing and talking. Now there are only ruins." Beth sighed. "If we can fix it, this will be the last chance for many families." JD nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "Then, we'll start here. But starting a center in a small town is not easy." JD knew he couldn't do it alone, so he started calling everywhere, from local businesses to old friends who worked in community recovery funds. One day, JD sat at Ruby's, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, staring at his almost checked contact list. As he was feeling frustrated, the phone rang. It was a call he didn't expect. "JD, this is Mr. Lucas from HopeWorks. I heard about your plan through a friend. Can you tell me more about the community center idea?" JD's eyes lit up. For the first time in weeks, someone from outside town was listening to the Springfield story. "Thank you, Lucas. We don't need fancy programs. We need real things. Vocational training, mental health support, life skills training for seniors, and classes for kids. I just need someone who believes in us enough to help us get started." The conversation lasted more than an hour, and when JD hung up, a rare smile appeared on his face. HopeWorks agreed to provide some initial funding if the town could contribute more labor, materials, and manpower. The next day, JD returned to Ruby's Diner to deliver the good news. The diner was nearly silent, all eyes on him as he said, "They agreed to provide initial funding, but the rest is up to us. If we don't do it ourselves, it will remain a dream." Mr. Walter, who had been the most against JD, stood up slowly. You can count me in. I used to be a welder. If you need someone to fix those rotten iron posts, I'll do it. Beth whispered, then stood up boldly. I'll call on some old friends of mine. Single mothers. They know how to do everything, from sewing to cooking. If there's a trade class, they'll help beginners. Frank also stepped forward, put his hand on JD's shoulder. I know a lot of merchants in the area. I'll ask them for wood, scrap metal, any material that can be recycled. Those simple words were like a spark that ignited hope. A small community, once thought to be broken, stood up for itself for the first time. On the groundbreaking day, more people came than JD had imagined. People who had never agreed to sit at the same table now worked together to carry each piece of wood, each piece of iron. The calloused hands, the haggard faces, now covered in dust but full of smiles. Frank holds the saw, Walter climbs the ladder, Beth brings everyone bread and water. Inside the old workshop, the dust and sand that obscures the midday sun gradually clears, revealing the light that shines down on dreams taking shape. JD! A voice calls out from the corner of the workshop. It's Beth, standing next to a pile of old books found in a rusty iron cabinet. Can we make a little library for the kids? They need a place to learn. JD walks over, looking at the tattered books that still hold the hopeful words, "We're not just going to teach adults a trade. We're going to teach kids to dream bigger than we ever dreamed." The spring sun shines its soft rays down on the town of Springfield. The sounds of hammers, chainsaws, and laughter echo from Walter's old workshop, which is now gradually transforming into the first community center in the area. A place where everyone hopes to open up a new future for those who thought they had been forgotten. But where there is light, darkness lurks. That afternoon, as JD and Frank were measuring the newly erected steel frame, the sound of an old pickup truck roaring into the yard startled everyone and made them turn around. Out of the truck stepped Rick Harrison, one of the largest landowners in the area and a staunch opponent of any idea of redevelopment. Rick, his eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses and old cowboy hat, walked straight towards JD. "I hear you're stirring things up here. JD?" Rick's voice was as hard as steel. JD raised his head, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and calmly replied, "We're just trying to fix something that's been neglected for too long, Rick. Want to help?" Rick sneered. "Help? Me? You're ruining what I've built peacefully. People like you think a few speeches and a bunch of villagers can change this place? Look, JD, a center like this will only attract more homeless and bad people." The yard fell silent. Everyone stopped working, their eyes fixed on the two men facing them. Walter stood beside him, his veiny hands clenched. Beth, who was carrying a tray of water, paused, her eyes wide with worry. And JD walked slowly toward Rick, his gaze unwavering. He understood that this was the moment when his resolve was tested. "Rick," JD said, his voice low but clear, "you and I both know this town has suffered a lot. People have lost their jobs, their homes, their faith. We didn't build this place to attract trouble. We built it to give people like Frank, Beth, and Walter a second chance. Not everyone is so lucky, Rick. Not everyone has land to keep. There are people who need a place to start over." Rick gritted his teeth, trying to keep his cool, but his sharp gaze began to waver. "Do you think you understand the people here, JD? You haven't lived here for the past 20 years. You haven't seen this place fall apart day by day. Now you're back, and you call yourself a hero?" The words were like a knife cutting into the heart. JD lowered his head, then looked up, his eyes shining with sincerity that made the whole workshop quiet. "I'm one of them too, Rick. I grew up among ruined houses next to people who gave up hope. You're right. I haven't lived here for the past 20 years. But I haven't forgotten. I went away just to have enough strength to come back and do this. And I will do it whether you're on my side or not." For a long time, no one said anything. Then Mr. Walter stepped forward, standing next to JD. "Rick," he said, his voice hoarse from someone who had smoked too many years, "once upon a time I was like you. I thought nothing could save this town. But I was wrong. I saw JD. I saw the children in the village come back to work here. I saw hope, something I thought was lost forever." Beth stepped forward, put the tray of water on the table. "Rick, maybe you're scared, because you've seen so many empty promises. But JD is not like them. He's doing, not just talking. If you won't help, at least don't stop us." Frank nodded too. "The kids, the young ones, are watching what we do. If we give up, they'll never dare to dream again." Rick was silent. His eyes swept over the people standing in front of him, the people who had suffered, but now stood firm and hoped. "Do you really believe this?" Rick asked, his voice no longer cold for the first time, but with a bit of the tiredness, the heaviness of someone who had lived too long with bitterness. JD looked straight into Rick's eyes. "I believe, Rick. But more importantly, I'm going to do it, and I want you to do it with us." Rick looked at JD for a long time, then turned and walked back to the car. He didn't say anything, but it wasn't like he was leaving forever. He was thinking, struggling internally. As Rick's car drove away, Beth breathed a sigh of relief. Frank patted JD's shoulder proudly. "You did well, JD. That was the first time I've seen Rick not outright object." Although the challenge was not over, that day, JD and everyone won the first step. Not by rebellion, not by arguments, but by sincerity, perseverance, and kindness. JD stood in front of the workshop, looking up at the orange sky of the sunset. Under the last sunlight, the sound of hammering nails rang out again, stronger than ever. "Shall we continue?" JD smiled, saying to everyone. "Sure," Frank replied, starting to pick up the hammer again. The sunset painted the unfinished walls of the old workshop with an orange-red color. The sound of hammering echoed in the quiet air of Springfield, like a symphony of new hope beginning. JD Vance, along with Frank, Beth, Mr. Walter, and the good-willed people, were still working hard to complete the unfinished parts of the community center project that they had put their hearts and souls into. But just when JD thought he had overcome the biggest challenge, Rick, the strongest opponent, returned. The next morning, as JD and the others were preparing to put up the remaining glass windows for the center, the familiar sound of Rick's old pickup truck rang out from the beginning of the red dirt road. Frank frowned slightly as soon as he saw it. "Wow, it's Rick again. I'm not sure what trouble he's planning today." Beth looked at JD worriedly. "JD, do you think Rick will object again?" JD took a deep breath, his eyes determined. "We'll see, but this time, we'll listen." Rick stepped out of the car, but this time, there was no cold look, no sarcasm. Instead, Rick's eyes were tired, confused, and heavy. Everyone stopped, waiting. No one said a word. Rick approached, his calloused hands fumbling with his old cowboy hat, his eyes looking down at the ground, then looking straight at JD. This time a look full of sincerity and guilt. "JD, I need to talk." JD nodded slightly, leading Rick to a quiet corner at the side of the workshop where the noise wouldn't interrupt the conversation. Rick took a deep breath, and then he began to speak without beating around the bush. "Last night, I thought about what you said, about Mr. Walter, about the people here, and I realized I was wrong. Wrong all these years." JD was a little stunned, not expecting Rick to start like that. Rick continued, his voice low, as if blaming himself. "You know, JD, you're not the only one who's lost here. I had dreams for this town too, but then everything fell apart. I lost my family, lost my only son to drugs. He should have been your son's age by now. After his death, I built walls in my heart. I hated anyone who came here with the intention of saving this place, because I thought no one else could. And I hated you, not because you were wrong, but because I was afraid you were right. Afraid that if you succeeded, I would have to face the truth that I gave up too soon." JD was silent. Rick's confession cut through the air like a knife. Walter's eyes were red. Beth whispered to Frank, "God, I didn't know he was in so much pain." Rick looked straight at JD, his voice breaking. "JD, I want to help, if you and everyone will accept me." JD stood still for a moment, then smiled slightly, a smile of sympathy and sharing. "Rick, I never thought you were a bad person. I just thought you were someone who suffered too much, and if you want to help, if you want to stand with us, this door is always open." Rick looked down, his eyes red, and nodded slightly. I'll do anything, JD. Even clean up, carry bricks, anything. JD put his hand on Rick's shoulder. No, Rick, you'll be part of us, and you'll tell your story so others know they're not alone. The group stood watching the scene, their eyes filled with tears. Frank stepped forward, patted Rick on the shoulder. Welcome to the team, Rick. Beth also smiled and whispered, with an extra pair of hands like yours, things will go a lot faster. Mr. Walter looked at Rick, then suddenly hugged the tough man. We've all lost, Rick, but now we're going to rebuild together. Rick laughed through his tears. I thought I had no one left, but it seems I was wrong. The news that Rick, the town's most conservative and tough celebrity, had joined JD's group spread quickly throughout Springfield. Those who had been skeptical before began to look back. Those who had been watching with trepidation now began to approach, quietly joining in. The townspeople began to realize if Rick, the man who had lost the most, the one who was in the most pain, could believe in the future, then perhaps they should give themselves a chance to hope. The gentle morning sunlight shone through the brand new glass windows of the community center, reflecting sparklingly on the rows of neatly arranged wooden chairs. The whole town of Springfield that day seemed to be wearing a new coat. More than a year after J.D. Vance walked into Ruby's diner and had that fateful conversation, his dream and the dreams of the people there finally came true. The community center, once an abandoned factory, now stands tall as a symbol of hope, perseverance, and humanity. A brand new sign hangs in front of the door, in large, bold letters. Springfield Community Center, a place to heal and grow. Bouquets of wildflowers picked from nearby fields line the entrance. Children run around the yard, their laughter echoing everywhere. Old people sit on the porch, drinking hot coffee, their eyes shining in a way they haven't seen in a long time. Rick, who had been a fierce opponent, is wearing the crispest shirt he owns, carrying a box of homemade cookies. Frank stands at the bar, making coffee and smiling at each customer. Walter, in his old but neatly pressed suit, sits in the front row, with Beth holding his hand as if to give him strength. J.D. Vance steps onto the small stage set up in the front yard, an old microphone in his hand. He looked out at the crowd, and there was a moment of emotion as he realized all those familiar faces were watching him, no longer doubting, no longer distant. J.D. took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm, but everyone noticed the red in his eyes. Everyone. When I first walked into Springfield, I thought I would just stop by, say a few words, and go on my way. But you made me stay, not because of the hardships, but because of the hope I saw in every eye, in every story. I know for many of you, trust has been broken. I know you are too familiar with promises that have never been kept. And I also know, perhaps I am no one special enough to change all that. But today, when I look around here, I know that we have done something that no one believed possible. Together, we have built not just a building, but a family, a real community. JD's voice broke and he paused to regain his composure. And I want to thank everyone here. From Rick, who taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, to Beth, Frank, and Mr. Walter, who gave me hope every day. This is more than just a community center. This is the heart of Springfield, a place where if someone is lonely, they can find a welcoming arm. If someone is lost, they can find a way. And if someone needs someone to listen, they can find us. The crowd fell silent. A few of the older men wiped away tears with their handkerchiefs. Frank whispered to Rick, I've never seen JD so emotional. Rick nodded, his eyes red. No one has ever changed me like he has. As JD stepped down, he walked over to Rick and held out his hand. Rick stood still for a few seconds, then took JD's hand in a firm but sincere handshake. JD, I owe you an apology and thanks. JD smiled and replied, No, Rick. We owed each other a chance, and today we paid it back. In the corner of the yard, Mr. Walter walked up to them with a cane, took both of their hands and whispered, You know what? Springfield is alive again. Suddenly, a girl about 10 years old, blonde hair, ran onto the stage with a small bouquet of flowers in her hand. It was Emily, the girl whose mother used to be addicted, but thanks to the center's support program, she had now started a new life. Emily looked straight at JD and said in a clear voice, "Thank you, Uncle. Thanks to you, my mother smiled again. I love you." The whole yard fell silent. JD knelt down, opened his arms to hug Emily, tears streaming down his face. The audience stood up and applauded non-stop. Rick wiped away his tears and said softly, "If this isn't a miracle, I don't know what is." JD stood up, turned to the audience, looked straight into the camera as if speaking to everyone who was watching the story. "I know, out there are many towns like Springfield where faith is lost, where hope is fragile. But today, here, we prove that. When people sit down together, when they listen, forgive, and join hands, miracles can happen. If you are somewhere feeling lonely, disappointed, remember, there is always a chance to start over and be the one to create that chance, like Springfield did." Dear friends, as the story of J.D. Vance at Ruby's Diner comes to a close, we have witnessed more than just a conversation between a politician and ordinary people. It is a story of courage, patience, and especially the power of understanding between people who seem incapable of empathy. In a society increasingly divided by differences in views, politics, and life, this story reminds us of the great value of dialogue and listening. How many times in life have we turned our backs on someone just because they had different views than us? How many times have we stayed silent because we thought we couldn't change anything? But the story of J.D. Vance shows that when we have the patience to sit down, listen, and understand each other, even the hardest hearts can soften. When we dare to enter a space where we know we are not welcome and remain kind, a conversation can open the door to hope and connection. Springfield, a town of suspicion, has transformed into a place of kindness and solidarity, and I believe that there are many Springfields around us who need someone to take action. It could be you. Be the one to start the conversation, even if you think you will be rejected. Be patient to listen before you judge. Build bridges, not walls. And most of all, believe that small things repeated every day can make a big difference for communities, families, and society. If you have experienced moments of misunderstanding or have successfully mended a broken relationship, please share your story in the comments. Please like and subscribe to help me continue to spread these true and inspiring stories to more people. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories, the journeys of kindness, courage, and forgiveness that society needs more than ever today. And you know what? Maybe your small action today will become a source of inspiration for someone desperate out there. Leave a comment. I am ready to listen and understand if you believe in the power of empathy and humanity. Let's create miracles together. If you want, I can write an additional script for the connection or emotional commentary for you to read directly in the video. Do you want me to continue?